Manisha and I wrote our paper on how two major court cases about the civil rights movement influence the history of special education as well as the education acts that are in place today. So the main part that I wrote started off with the history of education overall. And so it's important to understand that education falls under a state's government and not a federal government. So the state can decide however they want to do education. And it wasn't until 1840 that education became compulsory. And compulsory education means that it's legally mandated that students in that state participate in a form of education. And so in 1840, Rhode Island was the first state to have compulsory education. And then by 1918, so it took a while, but by 1918, all of the states had passed compulsory education laws. And even though education was compulsory, it didn't mean that it was equal or that it was fair to students that had disabilities, because that has taken a while to evolve. A court case that proves this is Beatty versus Board of Education that took place in 1919. And in this case, there was a student that had a disability that caused them to drool and to have facial seizures. And this disability disturbed the teacher and the students and grossed them out. And so in this court, the Supreme Court of Wisconsin ruled to expel the student because his disability was disturbing the teachers and the students. And they recommended that the student go to a school for students who are deaf. And this is very disturbing, but it makes sense because the laws at the time allowed for segregation and allowed for separation. And another point that proves this is before the Beatty versus Board of Education was the Plessy versus Ferguson case, a large civil rights case in 1819, and it involved a Louisiana statute that segregated road cars. So there would be a white car and a black car, and a man, Homer Plessy, refused to move seats. He was sitting in a first class white person's car, and he refused to move to the black person's car. And he was trying to prove that statute that segregated the road cars was a form of segregation. And the Supreme Court ruled in 1896 that the Equality Clause in the 14th Amendment that says that a person will not be denied jurisdiction, that within its jurisdiction the equal protections of the laws that stated in the 14th Amendment. In this case, in 1896, they ruled that protection of the laws only applied to political equality, but it didn't apply to social equality. So they did not see that the road cars were a form of segregation. And so the effects of the Plessy rulings, there were still people that believed in inequality, but some people were starting to believe in equality. And the Beatty versus Board of Education that I mentioned earlier shows that a form of inequality. But 20 years or so after the Plessy rulings, the Council for Exceptional Children was formed. And it was founded in 1922 by a group of students and faculty at Columbia University in New York. And it is a professional organization that's concerned with the education of students with disabilities. And it is all obviously for equality. And I just thought it was interesting that it started after the Plessy versus Ferguson case and before equality was a legal thing that we practiced. And a case that ended segregation in education is Brown versus Board of Education. And this was a part of the NAACP's plan to end segregation. And at the time of December 1952, there were 5 cases dealing with segregation on the Supreme Court's docket, and all 5 of those cases were named under a collective name, Oliver Brown versus Topeka Board of Education. And Oliver Brown was a father of a young daughter who had a very long commute by foot to school when there was just a school for white students only 5 blocks away from her school. That would have been a much easier commute. And in that case, the Supreme Court ruled that education facilities are inherently unequal. And so this helped them become equal and stop segregation in schools. And it is said that the ruling of this case was arguably the most influential legal decision of the 20th century because it provided pathways for equality in many different settings, but especially in education. And this helped the special education laws that we have today. So in Manisha's part of the paper, she talked about how the different special education court cases and laws that came to pass after the Brown versus Board of Education case. And she also talked about the things that we have in place today, such as IDEA and least restrictive environment and free and public education. And all of these were possible by the movements that were made in previous history. And that's a little bit about what I wrote in my paper.